Gee guys, it's Liam agus fáilte on fhíseán nua seo Learn Irish Online. You're all very welcome to this new video, guys. Video releasing free this week as part of Seachtain na Ghaeilge. And as you can see in this video, we're going to be looking all at the biggest and most common mistakes that beginners make when starting to learn the language and starting to get into basic conversation. With my job as a teacher, guys, over and over again, I find it's the same 15 or 20 mistakes that people make when they're starting off. You find that most of them, they're all pretty easy to make, but also pretty easy to amend, thankfully. So I'm going to be talking to you guys through what I think are the 10 most common mistakes, how people make them, maybe why people make them, and look at how it should be done instead. Feel free to check out the PDF, as you can see up on screen now. It's available to download along with this video. So it should be really helpful to kind of go through as we talk through them one by one. So without further ado, let's get into it, guys. The top 10 biggest mistakes beginners make when learning Irish. Right, guys, so straight into it. Number one, using the plural after cúpla. So what do we mean by this? Well, cúpla, as we know, means a few or a couple. But unlike in English, we're actually going to put the singular afterwards when we're dealing with the noun. Okay, it would be the equivalent of if in English, instead of saying a couple of books or a couple of days, we said a couple of book, a couple of day. Okay, now this can be a positive and a negative. On one hand, of course, it's tougher to get used to because it's quite different from English and other languages in that sense that you use the singular. But it does have a silver lining, guys, in the sense that you now don't have to remember the plural for when you're using cúpla. The plurals can be quite tricky in Irish to remember. It's not like in English where you can just tag on an S, so it's at least one less reason and one less time where you have to remember the plural. So we can see there, for example, rud, meaning thing, and ruddy, things. So the amount of times, guys, I see people jump and say cúpla ruddy, for example, or for a couple of questions, they'll say cúpla ceistena, when it should be cúpla rud, cúpla ceist. So always after cúpla, stick to the singular. Moving on to number two, guys, iver though, and actually involves though as well because it's using ein, though, and cathair for counting, guys. So as we have talked about, if you've purchased our bun course, our beginners course, we have one number system for just the abstract numbers by themselves and a different number system for counting, guys, right? Thankfully, both the systems are the exact same for all the numbers except for 1, 2, and 4. So we talked about this during the course, but the main thing is we can't use ein, though, and a cathair before a noun. If we're counting with those numbers, we need to do it as so. Leabhar one, which is the trickiest one because the order flips, as well as using a different word. And then gá rivra, for example, for 2 computers, and Kera law, 4 days. Moving on then to number 3, guys, we've got forgetting the H for the past tense. What do I mean by this? Obviously, we have the root in Irish, like in any other language, all verbs have a root. But the funny thing about Irish is we'll very rarely use this root by itself. The only kind of common time, or the only tense we'll say, where we consistently use the root by itself and nothing else is the imperative, guys. In other words, when we're giving someone a command. Take this, go over there, speak to me, anything like that, we'll just use the root by itself. However, we know we've got our different endings for the present and the future in Irish, and for the past, we don't have a specific ending, but in general, we just put on a H after the first letter. In other words, a shevu. So all these ones, such as piocme, togme, fogme, all incorrect. Why? Because we don't have a H in there, guys. So always remember, if any time in the language you're using just the root by itself and then trying to attach may afterwards or to or some pronoun, and you're trying to communicate the past tense, there's a good chance it's incorrect. A few exceptions are obviously any roots which have a first letter which can't take a H. Examples would be rithme or lawerme for I ran or I spoke, as the R and the L cannot take the H. These ones, for example, guys, should be fiocme for I picked, hogme I took, and dogme for I left. Notice how I'll also have the D apostrophe there on the last one because it begins with an F, and it would be the same for any of the other ones that begin with a vowel. Number 4, guys, is misplacing pronouns. This one comes up a lot for sure. And it's misplacing pronouns in both ways, actually. Putting in pronouns when they shouldn't be there, and also leaving out pronouns when they should be there. Okay, so the two kind of main areas, or the two main cases really, where people miss out on the pronouns is number one, just forgetting it completely because you've already put in the verb. Obviously, in English, we put in the pronoun first and then the verb. I eat, she goes, we make, for example. And this can be a bit off putting when you're starting off speaking Irish, guys, even though it seems like a simple rule, but we're so used to saying the verb and then moving on to the next part of the sentence that that's what sometimes people make the mistake of when starting off with Ghaeilge. Okay, so an example there, tá ag dul leat amórach. People have said tá, and in English, after the I am, you'd be straight on to the going bit. So do ag dul, and already at that point the sentence is gone. So just always being mindful to include the pronoun, guys. And this goes kind of to a deeper underlying point through all these mistakes and through the language in general, is when you're starting off, don't be trying to say everything fast and don't be trying to rush into things, trying to sound really fluent or trying to sound really advanced. The main thing is to get it right. Speed will never be an issue, guys. Speed will always come with just more time and more practice naturally, but you do have to consciously make an effort to be mindful and to make sure you're not making these mistakes. And the way of doing that is by slowing down and just double checking what you're saying. Okay. The issue then, in terms of putting the pronoun in when it shouldn't be there, guys, almost always comes when we're trying to communicate the verb to have. What do I mean by that? Well, as we've talked about in the bun corsa, when we're saying he has this, or I have a dog, or you have time, anything like that, we're not going to use the pronoun. We indicate who owns the possession using the egg form, the agam, the agat, or the ega, or whatever else, as we've discussed in the course. Okay, we do not need to say, for example, Neil may on Tom agam. We already know who owns the time, and it makes the sentence incorrect. Okay, it's not only not necessarily, it does render it wrong technically. So we just need to say Neil on Tom agam. The time is not at me. In other words, I don't have the time. Okay, Iver Kuig, guys, number 5, we're looking at the issue of Alon. So, what's the issue with Alon? Well, if you start listening and becoming mindful of what you're hearing when you're speaking and listening to English, you'll actually notice, guys, you'd be surprised how often we use a lot at the end of a sentence. Okay, so just for example, if there, I run a lot, we try to work a lot, he has to travel a lot, today I have to do a lot, anything like that. In Irish, we cannot do that, guys. So even though a long does mean a lot, and in most cases in Irish, we can just directly translate it over and use it how we would in English, we can't use it at the end of the sentence. Why not? Because we always need to have a vowel after a lot. Guys, it has to be a lot of work or a lot of people or a lot of time or anything like that. So this is something that comes up quite a lot for people, and people sometimes struggle to get their head around. So how do we get past this? If we have a sentence that we're trying to communicate, and in English we'd communicate it as, for example, I run a lot, there's a few things we can do. Firstly, of course, we always have the option of just rephrasing the sentence completely. So finding something that communicates the same idea but with different words. So, for example, rihin me gomininic, I run often, instead of I run a lot. Because I run often and I run a lot in English are essentially communicating the same thing. However, there's another trick we can use, and that's, well, to put a noun in front of a lawn. So often the way we'll do it, guys, is the verb we were going to use will change into a noun, and then we'll use something like often the verb to do or the verb to be as our verb there, because we'll need a verb somewhere in the sentence. Okay, so for example, I don't do a lot of travel. We're essentially saying I don't travel a lot, but we're changing what we're using as the verb. Okay, so if you think of the sentence, I don't travel a lot, well, what's the verb there? It's travel. Okay, but what we're going to say is a lot of travel. So change travel into a noun, and then we can normally just use do as our verb. Okay, be like saying, instead of I'm doing a lot of work, or I'm working a lot, we can say tá mé ag déanamh a lán obair. So that cuts us around the issue of if we were to say tá mé ag obair a lán, we can just use the verb to do, change the verb we would have used into a noun, tá mé ag déanamh a lán obair. Guys, one other opportunity you have, or kind of alternative you have, is to use more on, but be careful because more on can only be used in the negative and in question forms. But unlike a lawn, it doesn't need a noun afterwards. Right, 5 down, 5 to go, guys. Looking at number 6 now, and it's forgetting the key pronunciation rules. So if you've got involved in our bun corsa at all, guys, these have been covered completely there, so I'm not going to go through them now. But just remembering, I think a big issue for a lot of learners is, again, what I mentioned earlier of just trying to be able to speak really fast and be able to do everything straight away. They'll kind of look at a word and just say it how it appears. They don't actually break down how it should sound. Okay, obviously, once you get to a certain point in language and you have a certain amount of experience, you're going to be able to look at a word and subconsciously straight away have a very good idea of how it's pronounced. But when you're starting off, guys, you really need to slow it down and go back to our 3 main pronunciation rules: the DST rule, so the dentals, the H rule, and also the fadas and non-fadas, basically the sounds of both of them. Okay, so just remembering any word you see, just break it down, because a good chance, I'd say about 30 or 40% of words have one of the dental letters in them. I'd say about 50% of words have a H in there somewhere, and also 50% of words have a fada somewhere in there. And even if they don't, you also need to take into account how a non-fada vowel is going to sound. So just going back to basics, guys, taking your time with words and remembering what our key pronunciation rules are, as we've covered in the course, and then deciding how you're going to pronounce a word. Number 7, guys, and this is probably the most common mistake I would say I see beginners make. Not that it's a particularly important one or a really big one, but it is frequent, and it's air on downy. Okay, air on downy. So what's incorrect with this? Well, as we mentioned in the bun corsa, a bit like the numbers having 2 different systems, we kind of have 2 different systems as well for the days of the week, unfortunately, which makes it a bit trickier. What we have is we have all our J forms, which are just the abstract days of the week. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, J Lún, J Mort, J Cadín. However, when we're saying on Monday or on Wednesday or on Friday, some of them change a little bit. Guys, the biggest change is Sunday. Okay, you cannot say air on J Downey, unfortunately. As much as that may make more sense and be easier to remember, we can't change it now. We need to stick with the rules of the language, and we have to say air on Downok. Yes, okay, so Downey changing to Downok, and also the J getting dropped. You see something similar with the other ones. For example, on Wednesday, it'll become Aaron Gadin with a G at the start as opposed to a C. So just remembering, when you're saying on a certain day of the week, guys, especially if it's something like Sunday, also at Friday and Wednesday, you see more significant changes. Remember to apply that change and not to be saying something like Aaron Downey or Aaron J Downey. Number 8, guys, is dealing with emotions. So we have as the example there, Tá faragach orm, which is another one I hear quite a good bit, and understandably so, because emotions can be a bit odd in Irish. Normally, for most emotions, we've 2 ways of communicating them. We can go the more kind of English way, let's say, and say, I am whatever that emotion is. I am sad, I am angry. However, we can also say that the emotion is on us, and this is traditionally the more Irish way of saying it. Okay, so there we'll have our noun and our adjective. For example, if we kind of put this in English for a minute, we can essentially say there is anger on me, or I am angry. So we see there we have anger as our noun and angry as our adjective. Okay, so a common mistake is people essentially saying I am anger. Okay, or I have angry on me. So it's remembering, guys, that the adjective will normally be longer and normally have a little ACH at the end. You see there, for example, faragach being angry, while farag, the noun, is anger. It would be the same, let's say, for bronach being sad, and then brone being sadness or sorrow. It's normally just a little ACH or EACH at the end. So remembering which one we're going to communicate. If we're using the Urim or Earth or whoever it's on, we need the noun, so Tá farag Urim, compared to Tá mé faragach, more kind of English way of doing it, I am angry, using the adjective. Number 9, guys, is looking at mixing up the question words, and this can be a tricky one for people, there's no doubt about it. Just like in English, how all the common words, or all the question words, excuse me, begin with Q, pretty much all the question words begin with a C as Ghaeilge. Guys, we have cod, conas, cahin, cainfá, and so on, as we've covered in the bun corsa. So there's a big difference in between someone asking you when are you going, why are you going, where are you going, and yet the only difference in that sentence in Irish is going to be caithfean, céinfeá, cá, which can all sound similar. So it's just a case of learning them off, guys, and remembering how each of them are going to sound. And yeah, that'll save you a lot of time and hassle in terms of people asking you questions. Pretty much any question you get asked, there's a good chance it's going to have one of those 6 or 7 question words. So get to know them well, and also remember our rule with Kane, which we've also discussed. And lastly, guys, number 10, the last one, more of a general one, I suppose, rather than actual linguistic elements or anything like that. But it's just not to worry about more advanced stuff or too complicated stuff, guys. If you think back when you were in school, when you were in first class or first grade or whatever in school, you weren't worried about what maths you might be learning in fifth class or fifth grade. Why? Well, maybe it's because you were young and a kid, but also the teachers weren't too worried about it because it's all about step by step. You don't need to know the really advanced stuff now and some of the more confusing grammar stuff because we're just trying to get comfortable in basic conversation. We're just trying to express ourselves with basic ideas, answer some basic questions, speak a little bit about ourselves, about what we're doing. Just go step by step. So if you see something that appears a lot more confusing, or if you're only just getting started, don't be worried about the genitive case or the conditional. You see, I have some examples written down there. The plurals can be tricky as well as some more grammatical things or the imperative. Just focus on getting the basics right, getting your kind of 2 or 300 most common nouns, your 5 or 600 most common words, getting the irregulars down, getting your pronunciation right, starting to listen to a few things, and also just getting some confidence and having some fun speaking the language, guys. There's no need to worry about the more complicated stuff until further down the line. And trust me, once you get further down the line, that stuff will appear a lot less complicated because you've got the basics down so well. So, in other words, just take it step by step, guys. I think that is a nice way to end it. So, as I said, guys, honestly, it's the same kind of 15 or 20 mistakes people make all the time when they're starting off. So, if you can get these 10, for example, locked down, and you're not making them at all, or at least for the most part, you're remembering not to make them and you're remembering to correct them, then it's going to make a big difference for your own confidence in speaking the language and also for how fluent you sound. If you can get these mistakes filtered out early, they're going to be a lot easier to fix, or they are a lot easier to fix now than further down the line where you might have been making that mistake already for 2 or 3 years. And yeah, old habits is definitely harder to break, as we all know. So that is it, guys. Hopefully that has been useful. As I said, please feel free to use this PDF that I've been talking through. It's going to accompany this video on the site. And yeah, happy Seachtain na Ghaeilge, Láil Mhórach, Honnaidíobh, freshen, happy St. Patrick's Day this weekend. Hope it's a good one for everyone and hope the video has been helpful. Slán go fóill.